Giant phantom jelly. In January 2007, a fishing crew off the coast of Japan pulled something to the surface that had no business still being alive. Cameras got there in time. For a few frantic hours, marine biologists watched something breathe that had only ever been recovered dead before this. 300 needle-thin teeth, a body built like it walked straight out of the fossil record, moving in front of a lens for the first time in recorded history. Then it died. That one is waiting for you at the very end of this list. Right now, we start with something stranger. A single jar sat unidentified in a research collection for 60 years before anyone realized what was inside it. That's the origin story of the giant phantom jelly, fished up from the deep in 1899, mistaken for something far more ordinary, until researchers finally recognized it decades later as an entirely new species nobody had ever catalogued. Even now, Mbari, the institute with more deep-sea camera hours logged than almost anyone else on the planet, has only caught it on film around 100 times in over a century of looking. Sit with that number for a second. A creature with a blood-red bell wider than a manhole cover, trailing four ribbon arms stretching past 10 meters into total blackness, has had over a century and roughly 100 confirmed encounters to leave a mark on something. Anything. A diver. A submersible. Another animal its own size. It never has. Every sighting shows the identical behavior. Those long arms folding gently around a scrap of drifting food, never striking, never grabbing. 100 encounters, 0 incident. At some point that stops looking like luck and starts looking like the entire design. Pelican eel. Picture the largest mouth you can imagine on a fish, then imagine nobody actually watched it work for over 100 years. French naturalist Léon Valiant put a name to this animal in 1882, working off a crushed, lifeless specimen, and for the next 136 years that's essentially all anyone had. Dead catches, damaged tissue, guesswork. It wasn't until October 2018, off the Azores, that a research team filmed one alive and behaving naturally for the first time in recorded history. Notice the gap there. A fish known to science since the 1880s, and humanity waited until 2018 just to watch it act like itself. When the footage finally arrived, here's what it actually showed. A jaw ballooning out wider than its own body, looking built to engulf something with a pulse, lined with teeth so small and blunt they can't tear anything substantial at all. The mouth isn't a weapon. It's a net, evolved because 1,000 meters down, missing one edible speck can mean the difference between eating and starving. In 136 years of study, it has never once been tied to harming a diver, a boat, or anything close to human size. Gulper eel. A whaling captain named Sawyer hauled something out of the water off Greenland in 1826 and had no idea what he was looking at. A year later, naturalist Isaac Harwood gave it a name, and nearly 2 centuries on, it's still been seen alive in its own habitat only a small handful of times. Everything about its build argues for danger on paper. A jaw that unhinges into a pouch nearly the size of its whole body, a whip-thin tail making up 3/4 of its length, teeth curved backward like fishhook. Then the record breaks that expectation completely. In almost 200 years on file, pulled up by whalers, trawlers and now submersibles, it has never once been tied to a single attack. That's not a coincidence. Its body is soft, its muscles too weak for any real burst of speed, and that oversized pouch was never built to overpower anything. It exists purely to hold whatever rare meal happens to drift close enough to swallow whole. 2 centuries of encounters, and the only behavior on file, every single time, is retreat. Vampire squid. Most of what this animal actually does looks nothing like a threat. It drifts through some of the most oxygen-starved water in the ocean, slowly collecting marine snow, the constant rain of decaying particles falling from far above, and feeding on it the way a spider feeds on whatever lands in its web rather than chasing anything down. When something gets too close, it doesn't fight. It curls its arms up over its body like a cape, flashes the spiny underside purely as a bluff, releases a glowing cloud of mucus as a decoy, and vanishes into the dark. Now here's where the story turns genuinely ironic. In 1903, German zoologist Carl Chun looked at this exact animal, misclassified it entirely as a type of octopus, and still gave it a name built for maximum dread: Vampirotuthis infernalis, vampire squid from hell. The look does its part to sell that name: a deep red-black body, spiny webbed arms, pale blue eyes that seem to glow under camera light, and it took further study just to recognize this creature as the sole surviving member of an entire order found nowhere else on the Tree of Life. More than a century after Chun's mistake and his dramatic naming, not one recorded encounter has ever shown this animal behaving like the hellborn predator its own name still promises. Barrel-eye fish. What does a fish actually look like when every single specimen anyone pulls from the water arrives already destroyed? For 65 straight years, that was the exact problem researchers faced with this animal. It was first described in 1939, but its most famous feature, a transparent dome covering the head, kept collapsing the instant it left deep water, crushed by the same pressure change that damaged almost everything else about the specimen. Nobody actually knew that dome existed intact until an Bari camera finally caught a living one in 2004, still whole, still functioning. What that footage revealed looked almost invented. Two glowing tubular eyes rotating freely inside a clear fluid-filled shield, tracking shadows passing overhead like a periscope built out of glass. It looks engineered for something predatory.
It isn't.
That transparent shield isn't a weapon, it's protective glass, letting the fish's rotating eyes stay shielded while scanning for the tiny zooplankton and jellyfish fragments that make up its entire diet. It has no teeth built for tearing, no burst of speed, no aggressive behavior on any tape that exists of it. Researchers describe its movement as unervingly calm, drifting past bright lights and machinery without reacting at all. 65 years of mystery, and the answer turned out to be one of the gentlest fish in the ocean.
Fongtooth fish.
Here's something that hid in plain sight for 122 years, right under the nose of the scientists studying it. They described this fish's juveniles in 1833 and its adults 50 years later in 1883, giving each stage two completely different scientific names and treating them as two separate species, because nobody realized they were actually looking at the same animal at two wildly different points in its life. The mistake wasn't corrected until 1955, more than a century after the first description. That's how alien this creature's transformation really is, a pale, spindly juvenile that barely resembles the dark, armored adult it eventually becomes. The adult holds the record for the largest teeth relative to body size of any fish alive, fangs so long its mouth can't fully close, forced instead into sockets on either side of its own brain just to fit without piercing the skull. On camera it looks summoned from a horror set. Off camera, most specimens measure under 16 centimeters, smaller than a human hand, small enough to sit inside a coffee mug. Those oversized fangs exist purely to trap tiny fish and crustaceans in a world where one missed meal can mean starving, not to threaten anything remotely close to human size. A century of scientific confusion, and the punchline turns out to be a fish you could hold in one palm.
Pacific football fish.
Only around 30 complete specimens of this species exist in museum collections on the entire planet.
Not 30,000.
30 total, ever collected, since researchers first pulled one from Monterey Bay waters in 1985. Most of what we know still comes from bodies that simply washed up dead on California beaches decades later, several within the same single year, leaving scientists with more questions than answers about why they kept surfacing at all. The Pacific football fish looks the part of a monster, a spiked, bulbous body and a glowing lure dangling from a stalk above its head, dangled purely to pull small fish and shrimp close enough for one quick bite in total darkness. Here's a detail most people get backwards. The horror movie trope about anglerfish males fusing permanently into their mates, losing their eyes and organs until nothing's left but testes. That's real, but it belongs to a completely different branch of anglerfish, not this one. Football fish males stay free swimming their whole lives. They track a female down using an oversized sense of smell, clamp on just long enough to mate with a set of specialized hooked teeth, then release her and swim off on their own to search again. Neither sex has ever been documented threatening a diver, a boat, or anything beyond the width of a shrimp. 30 specimens across 4 decades of searching, and not one incident among them.
Frilled shark.
Remember the animal from the start of this list, hauled up alive off Japan in January 2007, filmed for a few frantic hours before it died in captivity at Awashima Marine Park?
This is it.
First formally described in 1884 by zoologist Samuel Garman, who studied a preserved female from Sagami Bay and was so unsure what he'd found that he built an entirely new genus and family just to classify it. Nearly a century and a half later, the global tally of confirmed sightings still sits under 40, most of them accidental catches in trawl nets rather than deliberate encounters. Everything about its build looks like it should back up the fear. An eel-like body, over 300 needle-thin, backward curving teeth, gill slits fringing its throat like a collar, a face that earned it the nickname sea serpent in old sailor logs long before anyone had a photograph to compare it to. And yet across every one of those documented encounters, not a single one shows an attack on a human being. It lives far below where anyone swims or dives, in cold water where it rarely crosses paths with a person at all, and those hooked teeth exist purely to hold soft-bodied prey like squid, not to threaten anything its own size. The creature that opened this list with one fleeting glimpse of life turns out to be the same one that closes it, proof that looking the part and playing the part are two very different things.